Imagine a scenario where a simple good deed, a gesture of humanity, is punished mercilessly. Now, picture that this action involved none other than global superstar Tom Cruise and a black waitress whose only crime was extending a helping hand when no one else would. What happened next is not just a scandal, it's a story that will challenge your understanding of justice, power, and the choices that shape our destiny. What you're about to witness will forever change how you see the world of celebrities and the structures operating behind the spotlight. If you think you know what's coming, think again. What happened after this woman's dismissal will shock you. This is the price of solidarity. That night, the restaurant was brimming with life. The atmosphere, though bustling, was warm, laughter echoing, glasses clinking, and the unmistakable aroma of food wafting through the air. The waitress, a woman with an easy smile and ever-alert eyes, moved between tables with silent grace, tending to orders with near-flawless dedication. Each customer was just another part of the routine she knew so well. But that night, something different was about to happen. She approached a table where a man of ordinary appearance, yet with a certain distinct aura, sat alone. He seemed out of place, as if waiting for something, or someone. His gaze was sharp, but there was a shadow within it, a melancholy he couldn't hide. When the waitress reached his table, he looked at her with a vague yet profound expression, as if weighing something significant. His voice, when he placed his order, was low and carried a tone she couldn't quite identify. A glass of water and maybe a little peace. She smiled as she would with any other customer and turned to fulfill the request. But as she walked away, something told her there was more to those words. It was as if he wasn't merely asking for something simple, but something far more complex, almost like a code. The atmosphere around them seemed to shift subtly, but what could it be? Was it just a coincidence? The man watched her as she walked away, his eyes fixed on her with an enigmatic intensity. When she returned with the water, his gaze was even sharper, almost as if silently pleading for something he couldn't yet articulate. For the first time that night, she felt an unexplainable chill. What did he truly want? But as always, she was polite and placed the glass in front of him. He gave a faint smile of gratitude, but something in his expression didn't match his calm demeanor. There was a silent weight in the air. "Thank you," he said. "You have no idea how much this means." She didn't know what he meant by that, but before she could ask, he slowly stood and, with a calm gesture, indicated that she should follow him. Something was about to happen, and she had no idea what it would be. She led him down a side corridor of the restaurant to a small, secluded room where the noise of the crowd was muffled, and everything seemed more distant. He took a deep breath, as if preparing himself for something. "But what?" I'm running from something," he said, his voice barely audible but laden with unmistakable tension. His eyes were dark, and his hands trembled slightly as he held the glass of water. But what could he possibly be facing that felt more like a nightmare than reality? The waitress, sensing the gravity of the situation, remained silent, waiting for an explanation that hadn't yet come. He, in turn, looked at her with a depth that seemed to pierce the veil of reality, as if measuring every word, every look. He swallowed hard before continuing. "I know this might sound strange, but I need your help. You don't know it, but this moment could change everything." She frowned, trying to understand, but at the same time, something in her intuition told her not to ask too many questions. She simply looked at him, waiting for more words. He studied her for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. "I'm Tom Cruise," he said, almost whispering, but his words weren't a simple introduction. They carried the weight of a revelation that would change everything. "And I'm not here for a movie. I'm here because for all the dangerous roles I've played, this is my greatest challenge yet. My life is at risk, and as strange as it may seem, you were the only person who seemed willing to help." She felt the weight of his words hit her heart. A chill ran down her spine as she tried to comprehend what he was saying. How could he be in danger? Why her? What did he mean by all of this? But he didn't explain everything right away. There was something more, something darker, that he wasn't ready to reveal. He asked for help, but with a caution that suggested the story was far more complex and dangerous than she could imagine. The waitress, with her natural kindness, was about to step into something much bigger than she realized. And, without knowing it, she had entered a game where the rules had yet to be revealed. She felt the weight of responsibility, but also an inexplicable pull to continue to learn more. What she didn't know was that by making that decision, she would become part of a mystery that even Tom Cruise might not be able to control. And so, with a simple act of kindness, a glass of water, the lives of both were about to be irrevocably changed. The next day, what seemed like a simple gesture of compassion turned into a nightmare. The waitress, still trying to process Tom Cruise's enigmatic words and the tension of the previous day, walked into the restaurant with a sense of apprehension weighing on her chest. The routine, usually comforting, now felt suffocating. Something was wrong, though she didn't know what. Soon, reality struck brutally. Her boss, the restaurant manager, called her into an urgent meeting. He was more serious than she had ever seen him, his eyes carrying an intensity she couldn't decipher. The room was silent, the atmosphere stifling, and even the hum of the air conditioning felt more distant than ever. She tried to take a deep breath, but her instinct screamed that whatever words were about to be spoken would change her life forever. He stared at her for a few seconds, as if deliberating on what to say, knowing that those words might mark a point of no return. The weight of the silence was suffocating. Finally, he broke it with a grave voice laden with unusual tension. "You've gotten involved in something much bigger than you realize. What you did yesterday wasn't just a lapse in judgment, it was something far beyond what you understand." She froze, her heart racing, her mind spinning. How could something as simple as offering a glass of water and a kind word to a man lead to such a grave situation? The waitress tried to make sense of it, but the words didn't add up. She opened her mouth to protest, but before she could form a response, the manager cut her off, his expression now harsher than ever. "You crossed a line," he said, his voice cold and cutting through the air. "We're terminating your employment. You can no longer work here." Those words fell on her like a torrent, a sense of loss she wasn't prepared to face. How could everything have changed so quickly? How could that small gesture, so innocent in her mind, have led to this? She tried to understand, but the manager's words were vague and disconnected. What did he mean by this? And why her? She felt there was something much bigger at play, something hidden, but none of it made sense. She stood there, stunned, speechless, unsure of how to react. Her body was tense, almost paralyzed by confusion. The feeling that something was deeply wrong grew stronger with every second, and the room seemed to spin around her. What she didn't know was that her decision to help had set off a chain of events now beyond her control. "You don't understand," the manager continued, his rigid tone leaving no room for negotiation. "That man, he wasn't who you thought he was. You have no idea what you've brought upon yourself by getting involved with him." She wanted to ask more questions, but the manager's words had been so definitive that she knew there was no room for further explanations. What once seemed like a simple act of kindness had now placed her at the center of something dark, something she couldn't even begin to imagine. She left the office, her heart pounding, her thoughts clouded, and her legs trembling. As she exited the restaurant, the weight of being fired seemed overwhelming. But something even more unsettling occupied her mind. The man, Tom Cruise, his plea for help, and the sense that everything was connected to something far larger and far more dangerous. She didn't know what was happening, but one thing was clear. Her life had taken an irreversible turn. She was no longer the same, and what would come next was beyond anything she could anticipate. As she walked away, she felt the manager's gaze following her, and she sensed somehow that she was being watched, monitored. Something was at stake, and she hadn't even begun to understand the rules. With every step, the feeling that her life would never be the same only grew stronger. Unaware of the depths of what she had just set in motion, she left the restaurant and stepped onto a new path, a path that would change everything forever. When she arrived home, the sense of disorientation hadn't left her. Each step she took felt heavier than the last. The street was quiet, as if the world outside had fallen into silence, waiting for her to grasp what had just happened. Deep down, she knew something was still wrong. What had really happened at the restaurant? What lay behind Tom Cruise's cryptic words? Her mind was a whirlwind of doubts and questions, with no clear answers. She sat down on the couch, her heart still racing, trying to process what had occurred. What seemed like an ordinary evening had turned into a nightmare of incomprehensible proportions. What did the manager mean with his ominous words? She had crossed some invisible line. But what was that line? She stared at the window, trying to focus, but something abruptly interrupted her thoughts. A simple envelope rested on the coffee table, as if it had appeared out of nowhere. The kind of letter no one would expect to receive. There was no return address, but her name was written clearly in an almost perfect handwriting. The paper looked old, but the seal on it was intact, as though it had been placed there recently. The tension in the room thickened, and a shiver ran down her spine. Who could have sent this? And more importantly, why? With trembling hands, she tore open the envelope. Her eyes scanned the contents quickly, and what she found seemed more like absurd fiction than reality. A personal letter from Tom Cruise. Not only had he found her, but now he was extending an invitation, or was it an order, to join a secret project. She read the opening words in disbelief. The paper felt heavier with every sentence she absorbed. This couldn't be real. How could she, a simple waitress, be part of something so grand and complex? How could this be possible? Tom Cruise was asking for her help, and more than that, he was explaining that by helping him, she had become a crucial part of something far bigger than a mere movie. It was as if he had chosen her, without her knowing, to step into a world she never imagined existed. Tom explained in detail, with an unsettling calmness, that her help hadn't been a mere coincidence. She had been a key, a necessary link in a larger operation that touched on something far deeper than any role he had ever played. She, with her innocent kindness, was now part of a plot that extended far beyond Hollywood. Somehow, he had drawn her into a dangerous game, a shadowy movement involving powerful figures, people who, if they learned what she now knew, would stop at nothing to silence her. She read it again, her mind struggling to process every word. How could this be real? He spoke of global conspiracies, of a secret network to which she now belonged without even understanding what was happening. The letter explained that she had been chosen for something much greater. Tom Cruise, unknowingly, had drawn her into a game with rules far beyond her imagination. And the worst part, there was no way out of this story. He had made her a key piece without her knowing what was truly at stake. The words began to blur in her mind. She had become part of something immense, something she couldn't even begin to comprehend. Tom Cruise's letter, with all its promises and revelations, now weighed on her like a sentence. She looked at the paper again, searching for any hint that it might be false, some detail proving it was an elaborate lie. But there was nothing. Each word felt more true than the last. She was caught up in something from which she could no longer escape. What once seemed like a simple act of compassion now revealed itself as the beginning of a terrifying journey, a plot whose ramifications could be infinite. She looked around, feeling the mounting pressure. How could she, an ordinary woman, deal with the magnitude of all this? How could she navigate a secret network involving powerful figures and immeasurable betrayals? Once again, she felt small in the face of it all, but she knew her life had changed forever. Deep down, she knew she was now tied to something much bigger than any choice she had made. Destiny had, in some way, shown her a path, but she still didn't know where it would lead her. As she gazed out the window, the night seemed even darker, as if she were being watched. She didn't know what was coming next, but one thing was clear. She had become part of something of global proportions, and from that moment on, her life would never be the same. She then realized, with growing shock, that the help she had offered the actor was not merely an altruistic gesture, but in fact, the crucial link in a chain of events he had been trying to avoid. Her seemingly innocent act had connected her to something far greater, something she could no longer ignore. The operation she had been drawn into was tied to a truth so dark and unbelievable that even she, with all her goodwill, hesitated to believe it. Tom Cruise was no longer speaking as the actor she knew from the screen, but as a man from a hidden and dangerous world. What he was asking for wasn't just a momentary favor, but her participation in something far greater and far riskier than any action film. The network of corruption she was now entangled in was not a simple story of corporate betrayal, but a conspiracy of global dimensions. Something that could reshape the world as she knew it. Something that threatened to dismantle the very foundations of power as we know them. Tom, now stripped of any pretense, continued, his eyes more serious, almost desperate. He explained that the reason she had been fired had nothing to do with the help she had offered, but rather the fact that she, unwittingly, had been pulled into a dangerous game from which there was no longer an escape. The company she worked for had already been warned to cut ties with her because her act of kindness had made her a threat. She didn't know it, but that simple gesture had jeopardized everything those in control sought to protect. Her compassion had now become an imminent risk, and she had unwittingly become a key player in a game of monumental proportions. She read it again, her mind struggling to process every word. How could this be real? He spoke of global conspiracies, of a secret network to which she now belonged without even understanding what was happening. The letter explained that she had been chosen for something much greater. Tom Cruise, unknowingly, had drawn her into a game with rules far beyond her imagination. And the worst part, there was no way out of this story. He had made her a key piece without her knowing what was truly at stake. The words began to blur in her mind. She had become part of something immense, something she couldn't even begin to comprehend. Tom Cruise's letter, with all its promises and revelations, now weighed on her like a sentence. She looked at the paper again, searching for any hint that it might be false, some detail proving it was an elaborate lie. But there was nothing. Each word felt more true than the last. She was caught up in something from which she could no longer escape. What once seemed like a simple act of compassion now revealed itself as the beginning of a terrifying journey, a plot whose ramifications could be infinite. She looked around, feeling the mounting pressure. How could she, an ordinary woman, deal with the magnitude of all this? How could she navigate a secret network involving powerful figures and immeasurable betrayals? Once again, she felt small in the face of it all, but she knew her life had changed forever. Deep down, she knew she was now tied to something much bigger than any choice she had made. Destiny had in some way shown her a path, but she still didn't know where it would lead her. As she gazed out the window, the night seemed even darker, as if she were being watched. She didn't know what was coming next, but one thing was clear. She had become part of something of global proportions, and from that moment on, her life would never be the same. She then realized, with growing shock, that the help she had offered the actor was not merely an altruistic gesture, but in fact, the crucial link in a chain of events he had been trying to avoid. Her seemingly innocent act had connected her to something far greater, something she could no longer ignore. The operation she had been drawn into was tied to a truth so dark and unbelievable that even she, with all her goodwill, hesitated to believe it. Tom Cruise was no longer speaking as the actor she knew from the screen, but as a man from a hidden and dangerous world. What he was asking for wasn't just a momentary favor, but her participation in something far greater and far riskier than any action film. The network of corruption she was now entangled in was not a simple story of corporate betrayal, but a conspiracy of global dimensions. Something that could reshape the world as she knew it. Something that threatened to dismantle the very foundations of power as we know them. Tom, now stripped of any pretense, continued, his eyes more serious, almost desperate. He explained that the reason she had been fired had nothing to do with the help she had offered, but rather the fact that she, unwittingly, had been pulled into a dangerous game from which there was no longer an escape. The company she worked for had already been warned to cut ties with her because her act of kindness had made her a threat. She didn't know it, but that simple gesture had jeopardized everything those in control sought to protect. Her compassion had now become an imminent risk, and she had unwittingly become a key player in a game of monumental proportions. The truth she was about to uncover was far deeper than any Hollywood story. That reality unfolded before her, its growing weight twisting her stomach. With every word Tom spoke, it felt as though she was being pulled further into a black hole of secrets and dangers. He spoke of networks of influence, manipulation on levels she had never imagined possible. The corruption he described involved powerful figures capable of destroying lives and entire countries without hesitation. It all seemed impossible, but as she looked into his eyes, she knew there was something real and terrifying behind his words. Despite the fear building in her chest, she knew there was no turning back. She was irreversibly entangled, as if an invisible thread tied her to that dark, inescapable world. What had started as a simple act of kindness now placed her at the center of a conspiracy so vast she could barely perceive its edges. The certainty that her life would never be the same weighed on her, and a cruel doubt gnawed at her. How far could she go without losing her own identity? She knew ignorance was no longer an option. Now, she had no choice but to move forward, though the fear of losing control over her own life consumed her with every passing second. Tom, noticing her hesitation, added with a gravity that seemed almost tangible. "I know it's hard to believe, but you're now at the center of something far beyond what you can imagine. Forces are at play here that are greater than any of us, and your role will be more important than you could ever have dreamed." She felt a pressure in her chest, a mix of dread and curiosity. How deep did this conspiracy go? And how could she possibly be part of it? But as he said, she was already in the game, and there was no way out. The world around her seemed to crumble, and she faced a painful choice: to follow what Tom was asking or face the consequences of having become involved in something far beyond her control. She looked at him, finally grasping the magnitude of what was happening, and one final question lingered in her mind. A question she wasn't sure she wanted to ask, but somehow needed to know. "And what will happen to me, Tom? What do you want from me?" He hesitated for a moment, but the answer was clear, even without words. "You're part of this now. There's no way back, and the only way out is to see it through to the end." She swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the truth in his words. As she stood up, the future of her life felt uncertain, but there was something in her eyes, something in her spirit, that said she had no choice but to move forward. She was now tied to a dangerous game, and the story unfolding before her was far more than she could have imagined. And so, with a heavy heart and a conflicted mind, she took her first step toward a destiny that lay beyond her understanding. She knew, more than ever, that nothing would ever be the same from that moment onward. She now found herself at a point of no return. The reality unfolding before her felt surreal, as though an invisible line had been crossed, irrevocably altering her life. The decision was in her hands: to stay in the game, exposing an international network of corruption that threatened everything she knew, or to return to her former life, where ignorance would be her only protection. The choice seemed simple at first glance, but the implications of each step were beyond anything she could foresee. She questioned herself, wrestling with the temptation to run away from it all, to return to the simple world she knew before that fateful night. But deep down, she knew she could no longer turn back. There was something within her spirit that wouldn't allow her to hide. Her mind, still reeling from the events, tried to rationalize everything Tom had said, but the truth was, she felt more lost with every passing moment. She didn't know what awaited her if she moved forward, but one thing was clear. By making this decision, she would become a key player in something much larger, something that could change the course of history. The ramifications of her choice went beyond her comprehension, and more than ever, she found herself entangled in something that transcended her own life. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her chest, yet the realization that she no longer had control over what would happen next was growing stronger. The simple act of helping that man, driven by her impulsive generosity, had placed her at the center of a global conspiracy. And now, as she prepared to move forward, she knew that, in some way, it would change her forever. There was no going back. Every step, every movement from this moment on, connected her to something she didn't yet fully understand. The world she was about to enter was more complex, more dangerous, and farther removed from anything she had ever imagined. And then, in that moment, she asked herself, what would she do if she were in Tom's place? He, a seemingly ordinary man, yet also part of something much greater, living with the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He knew his choice wouldn't be easy, that the truth came at a high cost. The doubt that now consumed her was whether she had enough courage to see it through to the end, even knowing that with each step she would lose something important about herself. She wanted to believe she could make a difference, that somehow she could fight against the tide of corruption dominating the corridors of power. But the fear of what she might become, of what she would have to sacrifice to continue, paralyzed her for brief moments. She looked around, as if searching for a sign that all of this was just a nightmare. But reality was much harsher, and she knew that by choosing to move forward, not only her life would change, but the course of everything she knew. A shadow of uncertainty hung over her, but there was also a spark of courage. What lay ahead was a mystery, but her decision was made. And now, I ask you, what would you do if you were in her place? Would you risk everything to do what is right, even without knowing the dangers that await you? Would you face the unknown, knowing that by doing good, you could be drawn into a reality far more complex and unfathomable than you ever imagined? Would you risk losing everything for something greater than your own life? Sometimes the real story begins when we least expect it, and for her, that moment had come without warning, without preparation. She knew she could no longer look back. The future was an enigma, but her role in it was now clear. She was about to become part of a story larger than she could have ever predicted. And with that, she would begin a journey of choices with no turning back. The true adventure was about to begin, and all she could do was move forward, not knowing where the path would lead her. It's not what we know, but what we decide to do with what we know that truly defines our destiny. And perhaps the greatest lesson we can learn is that even the smallest act of kindness can lead us on a journey we never imagined. She found herself reflecting on this as the weight of her decision settled on her shoulders. The simple gesture of helping Tom Cruise, an act that seemed so innocent and natural, had now thrown her into a web of intrigue, conspiracy, and danger. She had chosen to act with kindness, unaware of the deep implications of her choice. But in the end, what mattered wasn't what she knew, but what she would do with that knowledge, how she would use it to shape the future now unfolding before her. She wondered, as she gazed out the window, whether she could have made a different choice. But at the same time, she knew that something inside her compelled her to move forward. She couldn't abandon what she had just uncovered. She couldn't remain silent when, deep down, she felt that she was now involved in something that could change everything. Not just her life, but the fate of many around the world. Destiny, she realized, was never something fixed. It was a tapestry woven by the decisions we make. And that moment, that single act of kindness, had cast the thread that now connected her to a narrative far greater than she could have ever anticipated. The lesson she had learned in the past few hours was etched in her mind as an undeniable truth. What we do with what we know is what truly defines us. It didn't matter the size of the gesture, the impact of our choice, or the intention behind it. Destiny doesn't rest on our intentions, but on the actions we choose to take in the face of the opportunities and threats that arise. She felt that whatever she was about to do, the final decision to either continue or retreat, would define her journey and, by extension, the story she now carried within her. She took a deep breath, aware that the future was not something one could plan or control. What lay ahead was unknown, immense, and dangerous, but also brimming with possibilities. She knew that by taking this step, she would be launching herself onto a path of no return, where the price of truth might be higher than she was ready to pay. But at the same time, a voice inside her said that she couldn't turn back. Not now. Not after everything she had discovered. As the night grew darker, a sense of inevitability enveloped her. The pieces were in motion, and she, now part of this secret game, no longer had full control over what was to come. But one thing was certain. What had begun as a simple act of kindness had transformed into a choice that would define not only her life, but the course of a much larger story. And in the end, she knew that the true journey wasn't about where you start, but about how you choose to act when confronted with what has been revealed to you. With every step, she felt her destiny being written. And despite the fear and uncertainty, she knew that her journey, the real story, was only just beginning.